That was louder than I expected it to be. Okay, so basically, this is going to be a little different from other videos that I've done in most respects, but I was on Facebook the other day, and because I like going on Facebook because people say funny things on there a lot. It's great. And someone that I used to go to church with asked if anyone had seen the movie An Interview with God and for their thoughts on it. So I went ahead and bought the movie, and as of this exact second, I emailed them. They have not gotten back to me. This movie was funded by an organization called Giving Movies, I think it's called, and the charities that they give to aren't listed anywhere. It probably goes to like missionary stuff, and if you don't know, short-term mission trips are like horrible for the people they visit. So I wouldn't recommend buying this movie unless you're to watch it, and unless you're like okay with that sort of thing. I would recommend trying to figure out where they donate to first, to see if you're okay with, like, you know, all that. And you know, if you can, ask to borrow it from a friend or something. Anyway, until then, so I watched this movie. Basically, it's this guy who is losing faith in God. He goes to this interview with God, and then he asks him a bunch of questions, and there's a bunch of like theological and philosophical stuff, and it's all not great, but I'll get into that. But for a start, the basis of this movie, the idea in the first place is pretty bad, right? Because if you have a God character in a movie, God in this movie is an old man. If you have a God character in a movie, you are assuming from a theological standpoint that God character, everything that they say is 100% true. And that's a pretty slippery slope. Because like, even if you do believe every single thing that God character says, everyone is fallible, and putting that God character and being written by a fallible person, I don't think it's sacrilegious. I think most people would make an exception in this case, for the whole sacrilegious thing, because the movie is supposed to like explain difficult Christians to people, difficult questions, not Christians, difficult questions to Christians. That's a hard thing to say. But I feel like having a God character is just not a great thing to do in this sort of movie. Anyway, so the movie starts off, and this guy is going to the Afghanistan war to like witness the war because he thinks that'll bring him closer to God, because he's been falling away, he's been losing faith, and he says he feels like his prayers are like going to avoid. Then when he gets back to home, the scene comes up with him talking on the phone, or I guess through headphones, and his wife is like looking at pictures of them, and it's very clear that their marriage is falling apart. He's talking on the phone to this guy called Matt, who went to the war, and he needs therapy, but he can't go to I think it's called the VA, because, and it's said later in the movie that he can't because his job or something. It's really convoluted. It doesn't make any sense. I honestly don't care about the writing in this movie. That's not why I watched it. I just wanted to see the philosophical arguments. As a movie, it's not great. And as a medium to display philosophical and theological arguments, the arguments themselves also aren't great, but it's a good way to display the arguments, which I respect. Anyway, the marriage is falling apart because the wife had an affair, which isn't explained until way later in the movie. He blames himself, the wife blames him, or the wife is mad at him. Horribly toxic relationship, dude, get out of there. And that's actually never rectified in the movie. They just make up without anyone ever saying that it wasn't his fault, because she's the one who had an affair, which, like, come on. Anyway, so he goes to this interview. It's not explained why he has an interview. It never shows him talking to anyone to get this interview. He comes home from the war, and then he's talking to his wife, and she's like, I'm gonna be late for work and you need to get to your interview, and they just leave. And that's it. That's all the explanation you get. So he gets to this park, he rides his bike to this park. There's a bike rack, like I guess they're common in New York. It's just a single little archway that you can just lock your bike onto. So he locks his bike on there, and he walks into this park area, right? And there are these chess tables set up, right? So like where you bring your own pieces and you can play chess outdoors. But so he walks into this row of them, and right in the middle of the row, On the pavement, there's chalk that just says "this way," and with an arrow pointing right. And he looks over, and the guy he's supposed to be interviewing is there. He doesn't question that the chalk is there. It's never brought up again, other than at the end of the movie, where I don't know, it like glosses over it. It doesn't say anything about it. There's just chalk on the ground pointing towards this guy, and it's completely glossed over. I thought that was funny. So he goes and sits down with the interviewee, who we end up finding is God. The God asks him if he plays chess. God asking questions, because God asks a lot of questions here, and obviously it's to make it easier to watch, and to make the like, if it actually happened, quote unquote, if that did actually happen, it would be because the God character would want his name is Paul, by the way, and the wife's name is Sarah. I should probably bring that up. Paul, he probably wants Paul to like actually think about these questions. But anyway, so he says he used to play with his dad, but that just never comes up again. That's just like kind of a moot point. There are a lot of threads in this movie that go nowhere, and it leads me to believe that they just didn't have time to make everything they wanted to with this movie. Anyway, Paul says he writes about religion for a secular publication. The interviewee says he's God. Like, he doesn't question it. Paul doesn't question it. I mean, he like draws attention to it. He makes a weird face, but he doesn't question it. He's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm interviewing God. And that wouldn't be a problem if they had actually set it up where he knew he was going to this interview with quote unquote God. But they just never set it up. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't matter. Again, that's not what I care about. It's just funny. Okay. So, when God actually offers to demonstrate his godhood, he's like, oh, what do you want to see set on fire? Because Paul brings up the burning bush, and he's like, oh, what do you want to see set on fire? That tree, that pillar? But it's declined, presumably because the writers and the editors didn't want to do those special effects. But Paul just declines. This is presumably a reference to the verse. I don't remember exactly where it's at, but someone asks for like proof of God, or why God doesn't show himself or whatever, and God's like, well, if they don't believe because of the writings of Moses, Noah, and Abraham or whatever, then they wouldn't believe me, which is kind of ridiculous. I feel like seeing someone float down from the sky surrounded by a legion of angels would be a little bit more convincing than a book. But, you know, that's just me. But also, to bring attention to that verse, something I found really interesting. That verse is there, but also God literally blinds Saul, and then Saul starts believing, right? Because of the voice from heaven and the extreme light. And then someone comes in and like rubs his eyes, and the scales fall out, and he can see again. That story. So God showed himself and made Saul start believing, turn him into Paul and all that. But supposedly, no, if you don't believe because of Noah, Abraham, and Moses, I think those are the names listed. It doesn't matter. Then yeah, that just feels like a conflict. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, they get to like how God is outside of time, presumably to get at like the whole origin of the universe thing. Which, if God is outside of time, then why can't the universe be unrestricted by time and all that? But that's never actually brought up. It just says that God is outside of time. He says the nature of God is not obvious. That's actually that's not an exact quote, it's paraphrased, but they say the nature of God is not obvious. God says that. It's yeah, God said that in the movie. Anyway, but God isn't supposed to be a God of confusion. So like, if the nature of God is confusing, but God isn't a God of confusion, then why doesn't God make his nature not confusing? Because he's omnipotent, right? There are a lot of problems with a tri-omni God, an omniscient, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent. There it is. All-knowing, all-powerful, and all good. There are a lot of problems with that kind of God, but we'll get to that in time. So back on the proof thing, the God asks Paul if he asks for proof that God is listening to him when he prays, and Paul's like, "No, of course not." But like, why not? um, and then they get to the topic of non-belief, and God says that He understands that people don't believe because sometimes it doesn't look like God is real. But He's God, right? He could change that. So why doesn't God make it so that people believe in Him? I think there's a verse that says that everyone believes in their heart of hearts or whatever. That's just not true. I can very explicitly attest to that. It's not a lack of belief or the reason people don't believe isn't because they actually believe, but they don't want to believe. It's because they don't believe. I feel like that should be pretty obvious. I don't know if that's a verse or just some rhetoric that Christians spew, or the evangelicals that I was specifically around. But yeah, God could like make people know that He exists. That wouldn't like infringe on free will or anything, which is the entire reason for the entire justification for most people for the problem of evil, which we'll get to. Don't worry, they touch on that too. And then Paul asks God what the meaning of life is. And I quote, or well, I guess it's not a quote. I don't know this anyway. God says, "The meaning of life is to live, to struggle, to serve God, and to ask questions like, what is the meaning of life?" So part of the meaning of life is living, I guess. Why would it be struggling? Because presumably my initial hunch was, well, it's struggling. Part of the meaning of life is struggling because of Adam and Eve, right? But then why would God want us to struggle if He loves us? Why wouldn't He make it so we didn't have to struggle? And we could still choose between good and evil, sort of thing, right? I don't know. I just feel like that shouldn't be part of the meaning of life. To serve God seems a bit selfish, but it's God, so whatever. And to ask questions. So if asking questions is part of the meaning of life, why is doubting considered like doubting God considered one of the worst things? If we should be asking questions, then why should we hesitate to doubt things? Why shouldn't we question everything? I was told to never doubt God, to never doubt my faith, and it was really, really bad that I did do that, or if I did do that, it was one of the worst things you could do. So I would never question it, right? Because I thought that was such a horrible thing. It took me a while to break out of that. But if asking questions is part of the meaning of life, then why is doubting bad? And why does belief require faith? I forget the exact verse, but the Bible does say belief requires faith, and faith is trust, right? It's trust despite proof. I'm not the most qualified to go into that, but faith feels like kind of a cop-out answer when someone answers the question as to why they believe in God. But anyway, so then they get into the interpretations argument, which I find really interesting, because the interpretations argument I find to be one of the strongest arguments against Christianity. Basically, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and not a God of confusion, then why can the Word of God be interpreted so many different ways? Why is it that that it can be corrupted if that's the answer, right? So, like, if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and He doesn't want you, He's not a God of confusion, then why didn't He make it innate knowledge? Or why isn't it in a medium that cannot be corrupted that we can all understand? If He couldn't think of a way to do that, then He's not omniscient. If He couldn't do that, if He couldn't create a medium to do that, then He's not omnipotent. And if He could do both of those things, but He didn't want to, then He's not, then He is the God of confusion, right? There's just so many problems with that. But they say that the Word of God the Bible is the Word of God, but interpreted by man. Therefore, there are multiple journeys, like to God, but ultimately only one path. Presumably that's Jesus. So what I glean from this is that the small details don't matter, right? The entire point is, as long as you make it to Jesus, it's fine. I think it's 1 Corinthians, Paul, I think Peter, I don't remember. Whoever wrote 1 Corinthians said basically, if your brother stumbles from you eating meat or drinking wine, don't eat meat or drink wine. But if you are okay with that, then you can do it. So basically, the small things, just, like, you know, eating meat and drinking wine, you can have your own view on that. And if you consider it a sin, then don't do it. But if you don't consider it a sin, then it's fine, as long as you follow Jesus, right? But again, the interpretations argument, it leads back to that, and I feel like that's just a pretty huge problem. Even if the little details doesn't matter, and that's why God didn't do it. If God's not supposed to be a God of confusion, why is it interpretable at all in incorrect ways? So, you know, it's hard to come back to. And the interpretations argument does come back later when we talk about, or I'll probably bring it up again when we talk about the problem of evil when we get there. So then Paul asks God about heaven. He says that it isn't just a place, and then that he also says that Satan is overrated, and he only has as much power as you give him. And these are both things that I was taught. Right, heaven isn't just, you know, gold streets, pearly gates. Heaven's also like it's spiritual as much as it is. Excuse me. It's a spiritual thing, right? And then Satan has as much power as you give him. So Satan can't control you, but he can influence you, right? So he can only do as much as you let him. I mean, that's what I was taught. That makes sense. I don't know how much that's backed up by the Bible, especially considering Job. I feel like if we take Job into consideration here, Satan has a lot more power than Job would have ever given him. But, you know, we'll look past that for now. Paul asks God about souls. Souls are immortal. Otherwise, they wouldn't be souls if they weren't immortal. Which I feel like is leaning on consciousness and using consciousness as not necessarily as a proof of God, but as a proof of something supernatural. But that doesn't work. If you want to know what I mean, I can't explain it very well because, you know, I'm not qualified. I am as much a layman as you are, despite studying philosophy and religion all the time. But look up emergent properties of matter, especially in relation to consciousness. And you know, life and all that. It's really interesting, and you'll find ways around the lack of a soul in atheism. It's pretty simple. Well, simple's not the right word. It's pretty concise. There we go. And then Paul, this one's I find really interesting. The basis for atheistic morality. God says that atheists can be moral, but they don't have a foundation for their morals, and they should hope the earth never shakes, right? So basically, if their morals are ever shaken, if they're what word am I looking for? If their morals don't have a basis, so if something happens that shakes their worldview or whatever, their morals are moot, essentially, which I vehemently disagree to. We do have a pretty solid basis to our morals without a God. I don't think, now this might be debatable, but I don't think that morals are objective. I think morals are entirely subjective, but that doesn't mean they don't have a basis. Let me explain. So morals are subjective to each individual person, right? So for instance, and my biggest, not necessarily proof of that, but argument for it is there are psychopaths, right? And sociopaths, and they don't have the same morals as non-neurodivergent people do, right? So if someone is a sociopath or a psychopath, I don't remember which, it doesn't matter. If someone's neurodivergent, then they don't understand that, they don't have as strong of an empathy, right? So they might be more utilitarian. But someone who is empathetic might be more consequentialist, or I forget all the moral bases or whatever they're called, moral theories. It doesn't matter exactly, but you get the idea, right? Different people have different ideas of what their morals are, but the basis for the morals, there are a few actual theories. There's the social, and they probably all intermingle. It's probably not just one of these, but essentially, and this isn't exhaustive by any means. There's evolution of morals. So like people who were empathetic and held up morals were more likely to reproduce because mates would see them as more attractive. because, you know, they were empathetic, because they would share with people with similar genes, and their genes would get passed on because they had empathetic genes, because they had similar genes. And like, you're also not killing out your species, so morals are naturally selected for or it seems pretty obvious that natural selection would favor morals rather than incredibly selfish people. There's actually evidence of this in a certain kind of fruit bat. I think it's fruit bat. Might not be a fruit bat. Anyway, they go out. No, it's not a fruit bat. I don't remember what kind of bat it is. It doesn't matter. They go out to get food and come back to their cave and roost, right? And the bats that got a lot of food will share their food with the bats that didn't get much food, so that next time, if they're unfortunate and they don't get as much food, then the bats with a lot of food will share with them. So they share with each other. The bats that don't share get ostracized from the group, right? And they don't get shared with next time. So there's like a moral currency there in nature that isn't, you know, from sentience, essentially. So it is very plausible that that morals evolved, but also they're the social norms, right? So we want to like follow each other, and this is morals emergent from consciousness and intelligence. So if we do things for other people, then they'll do stuff for us. There's that feeling of debt, right, and guilt when we don't fulfill our debt. Anyway, you get the idea. There is a basis for morals that doesn't require the supernatural or an objective moral system like God. So then Paul asks if God is love. He says yes, but it doesn't boast, which, like, what? God doesn't boast? Is that what that's supposed to mean? Then what the heck was Job? Where, if you don't know Job, at the end of Job, Job is like questioning God, like, why the heck would you let this happen? Not exactly, but you get the idea. Job is questioning God, and then God's like, don't question me. I'm God. I slew the Leviathan in the chaos of the earth, or whatever. It's like, is that not boasting? I don't know. That's and like, even if that isn't, even if you can explain that away, it's not boasting. God is love, but it that's the exact word they use. God is love, but it doesn't boast. Like, what does that mean? Love doesn't boast? It's kind of hard to for love, something without its own agency, to boast. Anyway, okay, so this is where it gets fun. Paul asks, God says to Paul, you're not asking the question that most people question or ask me, right? So Paul's like, why do bad things happen to good people? And Paul says this is an arrogant question because the person asking is assuming they're a good person, and they're asking why bad things happen to them. First of all, no, that is incredibly incorrect. It's like, and even assuming they are, it's still wrong, because they're not just asking for themselves. There's no way they're just asking for themselves. And chances are they're asking for people other than themselves. Like, why do children get born with bone cancer? They didn't do anything. Why do natural disasters happen? A much better question, in my opinion, if they wanted to use this sort of answer, or if they wanted to ask this sort of question without going into like the nitty-gritty of the problem of evil, why do bad things happen for no reason? For instance, natural disasters and baby cancer. Like, that would have been a much better question, but instead he said it was arrogant because of an incorrect interpretation of the question. But a much better question, overall, in my opinion, would be, what is the purpose of evil? To which most people would answer free will. And then to ask to that, why do we need, or then if evil exists to allow for free will, then why can evil take away free will in scenarios such as kidnapping or torture, right? And honestly, I cannot find a satisfying answer to this question from a Christian standpoint. I've thought about it, and I can't find anything. I have no idea how a Christian would justify that. And the movie does come back to it later, so I'm gonna wait until then to bring that up again. But the movie's answer to this question is stupid, in my opinion. Anyway, but Paul actually ends up not wanting God to answer, because God's like, oh, well, bad things do happen to good people. Don't you want to know the answer to that? And then Paul declines, so God doesn't even answer the question. He does answer it later again, but we'll get there. And then Paul asks about free will, if we have free will, and God says that humans' free will and God's will fit together. They don't conflict with each other. Despite evil and God, humans' will and God's will don't fit, or they do fit together, which is weird considering the fact that there's evil, and God wants all men to be saved. I don't remember the exact verse, but there is a verse that says he wants all men to be saved. I feel like, but not all men are saved, so I feel like humans' will and God's will don't fit together very well. Anyway. Also, God hardens, there it is, God hardens people's heart multiple times in the Bible. The most obvious is Pharaoh in Exodus. God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he doesn't let the Israelites go. And like, is that not interfering with free will? And my dad actually answered this question for me a long time ago. I asked, isn't that like taking away free will? He's like, I don't remember his answer, but it just wasn't satisfactory, because it was kind of a cop-out, like, oh no, it didn't take away free will. He wanted to do that anyway. But if he wanted to do it anyway, then I might be strawmanning right now, so I'm just gonna stop. Point is that not free will? Is it free will? Who knows? It doesn't make sense. It's really hard to... Anyway, in other words, it's complicated. All of that can just be summarized. It's complicated. It's hard to explain. And I mean, that's honestly a fair answer, especially when the Bible is the Word of God interpreted by man. But that also assumes that God isn't perfect, or in my words, or in someone, I think it was Cosmic Skeptic that I heard that from, a tri-omni God. Again, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Okay. And then Paul asks, why doesn't God talk to everyone? Like, he asks, why do I deserve your special attention? And God's like, well, don't you? But that's like not an answer. What did Paul do to get to see God, or to talk to God? Why wouldn't God talk to everyone to like let them know that he's real? I feel like a lot more people would be Christian, especially if they knew that God was real. But he stays up there. You think God too stays in heaven, or you think God stays in heaven because he too is afraid of what he's created? Anyway, Spy Kids reference aside. He unlocks his bike. He leaves the interview, unlocks his bike, and like it's very, they frame him unlocking his bike, and then he just walks away from his bike. He starts hearing weird like whispers and noises, and then nothing happens. Why did they call attention to the unlocking of the bike? What was the whispering? I don't know. Never answered. On his way home, he runs a red light, and on his bike to get to the office. And this is brought up later. Basically, it's him not paying attention, because he's well, it comes up later. We'll get there. So he gets called on his office phone by a woman. It's actually Sarah's sister, and he's asked about his wife. The boss comes up, asks why he's there, because he's supposed to be on paid leave, because he went to the war zone, and he should probably have some time off after that, but he came into work anyway. And then they start talking about an interview with God, and the Sarah's sister comes up again later, but she basically, it's just setting up the character right there. It's pretty unimportant. They start talking about the whole interview with God thing, and the boss says it's about time God got to the front page. You disagree? Which is like blatant pandering to Christians. Like, oh yeah, I agree with this movie because I agree with this point. I don't know. I feel like they could have left that out and not changed anything else, and the movie would have already been better. So he goes to get milk, and he drinks straight out of the carton. I hate Paul, because he just drinks straight out of the carton. What a horrible person. But the milk is spoiled, so he spits it out. He gets unlabeled beer, As he's writing out the interview, he's listening to it through his little MP3 player that he recorded it on. He's typing out his little journal page, whatever. But then he starts hallucinating his wife's voice because, you know, he still wants her back despite her being the one who cheated and her being mad at him. Anyway, it's weird. I don't understand the emotional beats in this movie very well. They're not very good. So he freaks out because of the whispering. Okay, so then he goes to he just kind of like goes to a theater. And presumably he just knows because it's God. But with following that logic, why was the chalk there in the first place if he just knows where it is because of God? They don't explain it. It doesn't matter, I guess. Anyway, so they start getting to like salvation, and he's like treating salvation as a product for the sake of argument. He says it's good. Salvation is good because sin and hell are bad, but you have to die to like actually cash in your salvation. He says it's a product that can only be used by it being returned to the creator. So it's not a great product from a consumer standpoint, but the instructions I'm bad at speaking, don't worry about it. And then the Bible, which are the instructions for the product of salvation, is confusing. Which, I mean, you know, yeah, the interpretations argument and the whole God is not a God of confusion thing and seeming contradictions, which a lot of them can be explained away, but some of them are kind of confusing. Like, for instance, there's a book, or there's a verse in the Old Testament that says he had, I don't remember who it was talking about, but he had seen God and talked to God. But in the New Testament, it specifically says that no one has seen God face to face. Is that not a contradiction? When one person says that he's seen God, and then later it says no one has seen God, it doesn't explain it. To be fair, that isn't brought up in the movie specifically, but like, I don't know, it's kind of hard to like specifically believe the Bible, especially entirely inerrant when you have stuff like that. I figured it was just worth mentioning. And then God says that the rules are the important part, but so like the actual instructions don't matter. The only important part is the rules, and that would be the 10 Commandments at first, and then later he brings up the 6 commandments given by Jesus, which are the 10 Commandments, but without the first 4, which are specifically about man's covenant with God. And the important part is to love God, I guess. I don't know. But then Paul says that they're difficult to decipher, and then they just move on. They never explain why it's difficult to decipher, despite God not being a God of confusion. And even if the rules are the important part and the actual instructions themselves don't matter, why are they confusing if God isn't a God of confusion? It doesn't answer any questions. It poses more. It makes it harder to accept everything that's happening. It doesn't work very well, in my opinion. So God kind of just ignores the question, or the movie, I guess, is probably a better way to put it, ignores the question of the forgiveness of horrible people via asking for Jesus' salvation. He's like, so why can murderers, I don't remember the exact things that he says, but basically asks why horrible people can get into heaven, just because they ask for Jesus' salvation. And then God says Paul has a misunderstanding of faith, because he says he's always had faith. So God asks him if he has faith. He's like, oh, I always have. And then God's like, well, see, you have a misunderstanding of faith. But then it doesn't explain faith very well, especially when you go by the actual definition of faith, not only from the Bible, but also like, today's definition. Like, it's believing without solid proof. But I guess it's not. I don't know. It talks about it later a little bit, but it doesn't really explain what faith is. And then apparently there are a ton of people who are only concerned with what's happening to themselves. It's talking again about the problem of evil. And no one's concerned about other people, I guess, despite a lot of people being concerned about other people. And then they get back onto morality and free will. Morality comes from free will, because it wouldn't be morality if there was no free will. But it's kind of the opposite, because if we had full free will and weren't influenced by like cause and effect and like our brain chemicals, then we wouldn't have morality, because we wouldn't have any reason to not enact our free will. But instead we're limited by our like evolution of morality. And morality is kind of just the word that we use, completely separate from the actual reasons that we have it. It's important to separate language from the actual like concepts themselves. I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory, but you can't say that this means one thing, therefore this entire concept is just this one word. So I don't know. I feel like they misused that the word morality there, because morality isn't just the way we use the word. Does that make sense? I feel like this is really confusing because I'm just jumping from point to point without anything in between. But if you've seen the movie, hopefully you'll get all this. So then it goes back to bad people having salvation. It says you need more than faith to be saved, despite there being a Bible verse. I actually had this memorized this was one of the first Bible verses I memorized. I believe it's in Hebrews, but it says you are saved by faith, or by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. So if you are saved by grace through faith, so you need faith to be saved by grace. And there's no work you can do to influence your salvation, because if there was, then people who are saved would be able to boast, and pride is a sin. Does that make sense? So the movie is just straight up wrong in that sense. It says you need more than faith to be saved, but that's incorrect. That's just false in the context of the Bible. Then probably drink water. God tells Paul he's almost out of time, because Paul's starting to freak out about all this because he's talking to God, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, Paul overreacts a lot in this movie. I've been trying not to touch on it because that's not what I care about. And God says he's sorry that Paul's almost out of time. And later it comes back to it. And it was because he was about to commit suicide, but God knew that he wouldn't commit suicide, so he lied to him, right? Because he, right after he goes, he like stands on top of a roof and like looks down, and like it's implied that he's thinking of jumping. So if God knew that that's what he meant by saying that Paul is almost out of time, but he wasn't gonna commit suicide there, so he wasn't almost out of time, Paul doesn't die in the movie, then God kind of lied to him, right? Is that not a lie? I don't know. I feel like that's not a good thing for God to say in this context. So faith, God says that faith isn't something you can just have. It takes time and dedication every day. Again, by grace through faith, and it works. So it doesn't take dedication to have faith. It doesn't take time and dedication, because you can't. Your works don't influence your salvation, because otherwise you'd be able to boast. There's a verse about this that's very, very clear about it. It's very explicit, which isn't very common in the Bible, as referenced earlier with the Bible being confusing. This is not a good movie. If you get your theology and philosophy from this movie, scrap it all and start over. This is a horrible movie for that. So because God told him that he was almost out of time, on his way back from the interview to the office this time, he doesn't run a red light. Like, very explicitly, he almost falls over on his bike because he's actually paying attention now. And it's revealed that Sarah, the wife, had the affair before Paul went to Afghanistan. Paul thought it was his fault because he went to Afghanistan, and that's when the affair happened. But that's not what happened. And like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really change any of the emotional beats. So I don't know why they bring it up. Then the boss guy, I don't know his name. I don't think it ever says his name. If it does, it doesn't matter. But the boss says that faith in God saved his marriage, faith in God, because like they had faith in God to restore their marriage, and then the marriage was restored. I feel like okay, so if you think something is going to happen and it happens, I feel like there are a ton of psychological effects. There's confirmation bias, there's placebo. I think confirmation bias is one of the biggest ones that they bring up in this movie without saying it's actually confirmation bias. They call it faith, and signs and all this. And pareidolia, not exactly pareidolia, because pareidolia is seeing patterns where there are none. Actually, yeah, that's pareidolia. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Seeing, say for instance that you want a sign that that God is real. So you look to the clouds and you see a cloud that's vaguely cross-shaped, or you see you see a rock on the ground that's like a heart or whatever, and you're like, oh, those are signs of God and God loves me. But then you also ignore all of the evidence completely against God, the lack of evidence for a worldwide flood, all the philosophical shortcomings of the Bible, the apparent contradictions in the Bible. Like, that's what we call confirmation bias. And pareidolia is seeing the vaguely cross-shaped cloud as a cross, or the vaguely heart-shaped rock as a heart, right? So the pareidolia and confirmation bias, it uses those. They call those faith and signs in this movie, especially later on. And I just wanted to bring attention to that because it's bad. Don't consider pareidolia and confirmation bias as faith and signs. It's not good. Anyway, the emotional beats are pretty bad. Sarah wants to pick up, but she doesn't want to because she cheated and doesn't think Paul would want her back, despite Paul very, very obviously wanting her back. Anyway, Paul gets to the next interview, and God admits to manipulating Paul by saying that he doesn't have much time because he said he was gonna, because, and this is where he admits that he knew he was thinking of committing suicide because of all this. So God manipulated Paul, which goes back to the free will thing. So free will, kinda, it's complicated, I guess. Anyway, an actual interview happens. Paul asks God if he's just a clockmaker, which presumably points toward the watchmaker story. So one of the bigger, more well-known, there it is, one of the more well-known arguments for the existence of God is if you're just walking along a beach and you see a clock or a watch with all the perfectly intersecting gears and whatever, you're not just going to assume that was made by the waves crashing into rocks, right? You're going to assume that there was a watchmaker. Now there's a great book by Richard Dawkins called The Blind Watchmaker that goes into, I think it's like a 15-hour audiobook about why this is a horrible argument for the existence of God. But anyway, when God answered this by saying that he's not just a watchmaker, he's active in the lives of his children. So free will, kind of, is complicated, I guess. And then they get back onto salvation. God says that salvation is a gift, not a burden, despite you having to actively choose it. And salvation not being like second nature to us. So I feel like it's really hard to say that it's a gift and not a burden, especially the not a burden part. But, you know. And then they get into how there's a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Moses was a separate set of rules from that of those before him, and then that salvation was possible. It was impossible before Moses, and they actually had a set of rules. But if salvation was impossible, then I guess those people didn't have free will, and if they did, they weren't able to choose God because they couldn't be saved. So free will in that context didn't allow for, or the existence of evil didn't necessitate free will because they wouldn't be able to choose God anyway, right? So like, and then they get to one of the worst arguments in the entire movie, if not the worst. God says that Paul asks God if where did my brain go? Paul asks God if he's the one true God. And God's like, well, you don't see many polytheists around, do you? Despite there being like 2 billion polytheists worldwide, when you combine Hindu, Buddhism, and like all the pagan religions, there are like 2 billion polytheists. So that's one of the worst arguments in the entire movie. It's great. Anyway, it's just factually incorrect. It's funny. And then they get back onto the commandments, how Jesus left out the commandments between God and man, and your life isn't an audition for the afterlife. So you should live your life praising God, or like following Jesus, because, and like by following the 6 commandments after the first 4, which are the ones that aren't about God. Loving your neighbor as yourself, not murdering, not being covetous, all those. So I'm not entirely sure what it's trying to get at there, right? Because like, obviously you need to follow God. If you don't follow those first 4 commandments, they were the most important in the time of Moses, right? Because they were the first 4 commandments. But if Jesus left them out, he does say that you need to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So obviously you need to put God above everything else. So it's not like he left out those commandments. He just left them out in the context of those other 6 commandments. So when he lists them, right? So it's like, it's very cherry picking, right? And I feel like it's really hard to not cherry pick the Bible. In fact, it's almost impossible because of the apparent contradictions. And even when there aren't blatant contradictions, where it just seems like this doesn't mean this, but this means this other thing, and so on. It goes back to the interpretations argument. Anyway, then it gets to how, and I'm paraphrasing, but God says he doesn't always succeed. Hence, Noah, and on the flood. And maybe he was too vengeful in those days, despite the whole triomni thing, all-knowing, all-powerful, all good, or omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient. So if God is triomni, then it's impossible for him to make a mistake. But it says here that because of that he was too vengeful. So even outside of the actual context of the Bible, the movie is very clearly saying that God makes mistakes, which is just untrue when you ask the Bible. When you actually look at history from a secular standpoint, yeah, it's arguable. In fact, pretty obvious that God made plenty of mistakes. When you're just looking at what actually happens in the Bible without all the rhetoric of God being the one true God and all-powerful and all-knowing and all that. But if you're a Christian, don't get your theology from this movie. If you're not a Christian, why are you here? And also, don't get your theology, especially of what Christians believe, from this movie, because there's a lot wrong with this movie. Like, even when I was a Christian, I wouldn't have agreed with most of this movie, because it's just straight up incorrect in a lot of places. So then it gets to Paul being annoyed about the whole God thing. He starts freaking out because of all the personal issues with his wife cheating on him and having gone to the war and all that. Then Paul sends a picture of God to I think Matt, which is the guy who died, or not who died, who had PTSD from Afghanistan. And he's like, oh, this guy who God looks like died in Afghanistan 12 years ago. Paul was thinking, and I mentioned this earlier, Paul was thinking of jumping off of a roof after the second interview. And I'm jumping between things, right? The movie does this too. I'm sorry. I'm trying to make it as concise as possible. Oops, I just punched my TV. I'm trying to make it as concise as possible in chronologically with the actual order of the movie. It's just really hard because the movie is in a horrible chronology. Anyway, God brings up how there aren't always signs when someone needs help. And the boss actually brought this up earlier too. I didn't mention it because it's like completely irrelevant at that point in the movie. God says that much, and he says you can't hide from God. And he's saying that Paul lost his way, insinuating that there is a way to begin with, that like there is fate that we can stray from, that there is a destiny that we are predestinated to reach, but that we can stray from it. which again goes to the interpretations argument. You can watch my Calvinism video if you want more information on the whole predestinated thing and other views on that. Anyway, it's so free will, kind of, it's complicated. Back to that. So again, the movie jumps kind of all over the place. It's a little bit more concise when you actually watch the movie, because it actually brings up the setups, but it's not that much less confusing. It then goes back to the whole problem of evil, how people only notice when bad things happen to them, except, you know, baby cancer, or hurricanes, earthquakes, other natural disasters. And charities just wouldn't exist if that were true. People wouldn't be donating to help people other than them. If people only noticed when bad things happen to them, I feel like that's pretty obvious, even from a Christian standpoint. So again, this isn't a great movie to get your philosophy, morality, whatever from. And God doesn't help with baby cancer and natural disasters because we can fix it. God's like, oh, Paul, you have more power than you ever thought you did. How diseases can be cured and people can be fed, more food can be grown, more energy can be created. But that's just not true. There is a point that we just can't do anymore. I mean, yeah, we can do a lot more than we're doing now, and I do agree that we should be calling people to action. But you can't just say, oh, we can solve all the issues, we don't need help from God, assuming that God exists, when that's very clearly untrue. We can't cure cancer right now. That's like, baby, how the heck are we supposed to cure baby cancer if we can't heal cancer? What the heck, God? It also doesn't explain why free will can't be taken, or can be taken away by evil. So again, why kidnapping and rape and torture happen. It doesn't explain that at all, again. So it doesn't even answer the problem of evil other than, oh, you can fix it, it's fine. Like, no, it's not. We can't fix most of it. That's why it's evil. That's why we want help from God. But God isn't helping because we can fix it even though we can't fix it. This movie sucks. And then God leaves in a flash of light. Paul's bike gets stolen, but Matt, the war guy who had PTSD, gets better, and then Sarah and Paul make up for some reason. And so when Sarah, when he sees Sarah at the apartment building, they talk and whatever, and then Paul's like, do you think you coming here today, you know, something that she explicitly chose to do, and this goes back to the confirmation bias thing in pareidolia thing. He says, do you think you coming here today was a sign, despite her choosing to come there? So how could it have possibly been a sign if she chose to do it under her own free will? But then, like, it's just, obviously it's not a sign. Why does the movie even pose that question? It's posed as a rhetorical question, or like, yes, of course it's a sign, but no, it's not a sign. There's no way it could possibly be a sign because she chooses it to happen. I feel like faith causes mundane things to be seen as awesome, right? So like, someone choosing to meet up with someone isn't a sign, but people with faith, and I can attest because I did this, will think that mundane things are signs. And then the movie also says at the end how faith isn't worth much if you don't believe in the first place, and you can just believe by looking for proof. So you can believe if you have confirmation bias. Also, you can't really choose to believe. Belief isn't a choice. And if you don't believe me, go look up to the sky and believe that the flying spaghetti monster is directly above you. You can't choose what to believe. I feel like that's pretty obvious. Anyway, so clearly I have a lot of problems with this movie. Problem of evil, interpretations argument, belief, confirmation bias, pareidolia. Free will is a huge problem with this movie. It's just all over the place. Nothing is properly answered. This movie is not good. If you're looking for a source for your philosophy, for your theology, for your belief, for your historicity, none of it should come from this movie. This movie is not a good basis for information. Anyway, thanks for listening to my rambling for, how long has it been? It's been an hour. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I actually really enjoyed. I didn't enjoy watching the movie. It's not a great movie, but I did really enjoy tearing into it. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I love you all, and I don't know how to end this.